Good morning, everyone. Perek Tes, Mishna Zayin. Hamanakesh im ha'evek ha'chavim b'chasiyos. We'll translate this literally. Hamanakesh means someone who is weeding with a Gentile in chasiyos. Chasiyos is a word for certain bulbous plants. The Yad Avram brings down that perhaps the word chasa, which means to be sheltered or covered, is referring to the types of edible type of bulbs that the edible bulbs are found underground. So it's chasa, it's covered over. The point is that you are working in a non-Jewish field in the chasiyos, using these bulbous plants, which would include, let's see. I thought there brought some examples here. But the point is that these are bulbous plants, which, as we said previously, if we're talking about a bulbous plant and you planted tevel, like of an onion, then when it grows out of it has the same status as the original plant. Now, in this case, you're working with such types of plants in a field of a non-Jew. Now, the Mishna says, even though his fruits, his produce is tevel, you can eat from them in a casual way, in a snacking way, in an informal way. So you're working in this field. It's a non-Jewish field. And although the Mishnah uses the word menakesh, which means weeding, we see from the rest of the Mishnah, we're talking about eating what you're working on. So these are not weeds. These are actually edible parts of the plant, but we're calling it weeding it because you're pulling out excess bulbs, which the farmer does to allow space for remaining bulbs to grow larger, or it refers to pruning the excess leaves or the growing plants. But the point is you are cutting off the edible part of these plants. And we say that even though they are tevel, you can still snack from them. When we talk about a non-Jewish field in Eretz Yisrael, that's what we're talking about, we have to first establish if a non-Jew owns a field in Eretz Yisrael, does his produce have an obligation of Trumas and Maasros from it? Now, clearly, a non-Jew does not have an obligation to separate Trumas and Maasros. The question is, though, if there is a field owned by a non-Jew and something grows from it, and a Jew wants to eat from that, does the Jew have to separate Trumas and Maasros from it? Does the fact that it belongs to a non-Jew exempt what's ever growing from even an obligation of a Truma and Maaser? Or do we say no? He personally isn't obligated, but what grows has the obligation, and therefore, if a Jew wants to eat it, the Jew has to separate Trumas and Maasros. So this Mishnah is following the opinion that a non-Jew who purchases land in Israel does not nullify the obligation of Trumas and Maasros grows, which means what grows from his field is tevel, like any other grain. Now, by any other grain, we've been discussing that until the grain is processed, you can snack from it. Once it's processed, you can't snack from it. Now, here we're talking about where the non-Jew, you're already working in his field. We're talking about you're working in his field. You're helping him cut things down. And the question is, can you eat from these things? Now, you may say, why should you eat? It's not yours. And the answer is because the Torah actually tells us that a worker, while he's working in the field, while he's harvesting and cutting things down, he's allowed to snack from what he eats. The Torah allows that. And therefore, this non-Jew could not allow that to happen in its field in Eretz Yisrael. Torah mandates that a person who's working in the field, you have to allow them to work, to eat from it. And therefore, it doesn't make a difference you're working for a Jew or a non-Jew, you have a right to eat from it. But here's the problem. The problem is that we don't really know what the guy planted. Meaning, this guy, because he has an obligation to Trumas and Maasros, he's going to take tevel seeds, meaning what would to us be tevel seeds, and plant them, tevel bulbs in this case, and plant them. And we have said until now that once you process, when you completely process what's grown, then you can't even snack from it. In the case of a bulb, when you basically cut it off and bundle it, that's the completion of its processing. And therefore, the assumption is that the guy who planted these bulbs, he planted the bulbs after they were processed. And therefore, we have here seemingly a classic case of bulbous plants being planted and more growth from them, which we said before in the case of a seed that doesn't decompose, a bulbous plant, there, the status of the plant is like the original tevel. If the original tevel was processed, you can't snack from it. What grows from it, even though it's not processed yet, has the same status of what originally grew, and therefore you can't snack from it either because it hasn't been processed. So here, this person who's working for the non-Jew, as we said before, the fact belongs to the non-Jew does not exempt it from Chumas and Maasros for the Jew. So here he is, this worker who should have the right to snack from what he's eating from. The problem is he'd be snacking from tevel that was processed, or he'd be snacking from what grew from processed tevel, which we said before has the status of where it came from, is processed tevel. Now let us snack from it. But the Mishnah says that he can. He can snack from it. Why? And the answer is because our Mishnah holds of the following principle. That interestingly, even though what grows from the field of a guy may, for a Jew, have the obligation of Chumas and Maasros, but if the guy processes it, meaning the guy puts on the final touches so that the obligation of Truma comes on, and as we said, until the completion of the processing, you can only snack, which is rabbinic. Once you process it, that is when the obligation to separate Chumas and Maasros, actualizes on this grain. So now, if it's the guy who did that completion, if it's the guy who brought the grain to that point where the obligation should now take effect on this grain, but it was a guy who did it, then it becomes exempt. Because if it's the non-Jew, if the person who's not obligated is the one who's doing what it takes to bring on the actual obligation, to affect the actual obligation, it doesn't happen because he's exempt from it. So he can't bring upon this grain the actual obligation. He can't actualize it on the grain. And therefore, the grain actually, according to Torah law, becomes exempt. So although it starts off as tevel, because of the fact that we say that the guy's purchase of the ownership of the land doesn't take off obligation, but his processing of it, his completing the processing of it, will exempt it from Chumas and Maasros. All right. Now, nonetheless, the sages said that if this happens, you still have to separate Chumas and Maasros, because they were concerned that people who can afford it will hire Goyim to do the processing, and then they won't have any obligations of Chumas and Maasros. So therefore, they said, Midrabanan, according to rabbinic law, if a non-Jew completes the process, he's still got to separate Chumas and Maasros. But our Mishnah is saying, though, that you can still snack from them. So what that means, there's two explanations to that. It could mean, according to some, it does mean that when the guy does the processing, so now we have the completed grain, and midrabanan we say it's not exempt from truma, which means if midrabanan this is obligated in truma, then this is talking about grain that is processed that's obligated in truma, and therefore you shouldn't be able to snack. The Mishnah is telling us that in this case, where the guy's processing really had exempted it, but the sages put an obligation upon it still, they did not forbid snacking on it, even at the stage of its completed process. So that would mean that anytime this happens, when the guy does the completion and the obligation to separate truma after its completion is midrabanan, which is what it is, the sages did not allow in this kind of case that you can snack on it, even though it's completely processed. Others learn that when our Mishnah says you can snack from it, it's specifically in this case, where we're talking about what grew from his tevel, Our case is that we assume he took tevel and he planted it, which is very, very strong, very, very strong assumption. Okay, so we're talking about what grows from tevel. So it could be that that the sages were lenient in this case, where we're talking about what grows from tevel, and it grew from processed tevel, where we say that typically we say what grows from processed tevel has the status of processed tevel and you can't snack from it. Here, where the processing was done by the guy, and we're talking about what grows from the tevel, not the tevel itself, not that itself what grew, but what grew from it. That's where the sages were lenient, and they said that in this kind of case where the processing was done by a guy, and therefore the obligation for truma is only midrabanan, here what grew from that, we say you can snack on, even though it grew from something that was processed. If we're talking about the actual grain that was processed, and the Rabbanan said we treat it like truma, that actual grain that grew, that original grain that grew, that original tevel, we treat it like regular tevel. If it's processed, you can't snack from it. But what grows from it, that is what our Mishnah says. They were lenient, and they said you can eat from it in a informal way to snack on it. Okay, that's the first part of the Mishnah. Next part of the Mishnah deals with the following case: Shasile teruma shenitma'u. You've got these shasile truma means sets of truma. We would call them nursery plants of truma. You had, for instance, young plants that were plucked from the ground and transplanted elsewhere. But it was truma. Now, with some species such as cabbage, vetch, and leeks, the young plants are also fit to be eaten in their present state. Therefore, they are, number one, they can be made truma. They are truma. And number two, being that they're edible plants can contract truma as foods, but only when they are detached from the ground. Okay, and that's this case, right? Shasile truma shenitmu. They were, nursery plants that were nursery sets of plants that were detached from the ground. When they were detached from the ground, they became tummy, and they definitely become tummy because they're edible to their food. Okay. And since they are detached from the ground, they are considered food. While they're attached to the ground, they're not considered food. And therefore, but they would not contract tumah in that state. But here, we're talking about they were detached when they contracted the tumah. What you did after that is shasala. You replanted them. You replanted them in the ground. Now, by replanting them, what you've done now is you've actually changed it from a food to just a plant. Anything that's connected to the ground is not food. It's not meant to be eaten. So even in a case where, so not only does it not contract tumah in that state of being connected to the ground, but if it already was tameh, the tumah will go off, according to Torah law. The tumah will go off because the same rule applies with a utensil. If a utensil is tameh and then you smash it, it's not a utensil anymore, the pieces aren't tameh anymore. If a food is now changed into a state that it's not food anymore, like in this case, when it's planted in the ground, the tumah that it had is going to go off. So the Mishnah says like this. So this makes, this can, so you've got these called saplings of truma, or I don't know if saplings. Saplings a tree. Here we're talking about plants. So you've got these sets of plants. They became tameh and they were replanted. So what happens to them? Now, the fact that replanted isn't going to take off their truma status. That's not going to happen. We know gedulei truma is truma. What grows from truma is truma. But now the question is, what happens though? For the tumah? What happens for the tumah here? So now again, we're talking about these plants that are tameh. You're planting them. And now actually, we're not talking about what grows from it. We want to know what happens to it itself. It's truma. Now it's planted in the ground. So we say it like this, Tarim Milatame. It loses its status of tuma. It doesn't lose its status of truma, even though it's planted in the ground, which is interesting to note. Just kind of realize that. It doesn't lose the status of truma, from what I understand. But it would become tar milatame, but it does become purified. Because as you said before, once it's planted into the ground, it's not a food anymore. If it's not food, the tumah doesn't remain. Okay? So it seems like we have a solution here, but we don't. Because the Mishnah says, Va'asurin milachol, be not allowed to eat them. The sages adapted a higher standard for truma. We know truma that is tameh, you're not allowed to eat. Now, if you plant them in the ground, the tumah goes off, then you should be able to eat it. It's not tameh truma, it's pure. And the answer is that no. There was a higher standard given to truma that if it was tameh, and at that point it was forbidden, even though you planted it, which should, from the Torah point, from the Torah law, take off the impurity, the Chachamim felt they had to apply a higher standard to truma, and therefore we still treat it like truma that is tameh, you can't eat it. But as it does say, tar milatame, it won't make something else tameh. If this was considered real, if these plants were considered really tumah, let's say before I replanted them, and they touched other food, they touched other truma, they can invalidate it. They can make the other truma impure, they can make the other truma impure. That's not going to happen here. Once it's planted in the ground, the truma falls off, it will not make something else tameh. But you still can't eat it. You still have, when it comes to eating, you got to treat it like truma tameya, ad shiyagoy mesa'eichel, until you trim the food. Which means that once you go ahead and you trim the edible portions of the plant, leaving only its inedible core and roots, then what grows from the new core is permissible. That's what Chachamim said. What was tameh and was planted, when it comes to eating, you still got to treat it like truma that's tameh. But once you cut off everything that's edible, what grows anew now is grown as it's pure. It's not impure. And again, my understanding is it would still be truma because it started off from truma. And it's clear from the fact that we say it's usher to eat, that the original bulbs are usher to eat, that that's planted in the ground remains truma. And what grows further, I believe it's going to also be truma. However, once you cut off the edible parts of the original plant and the new stuff grows, it's not going to be considered even rabbinically tameh, and therefore the Kohen can eat it. Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda says that the Chachamim went even further. The first stuff that grows, meaning you take the original plant that was tameh, was stuck in the ground, you cut off all the edible parts. Now new stuff grows. Rabbi Yehuda says that stuff that you can't eat either. That also has to be treated like truma tameya. But when you after you cut off that, what grows after that, then already is not tameh anymore. That's what it means. According to Yehuda, Mishna, you have to cut and repeat. You have to cut off the original plant, then you got to cut off what grows right after that. After that, whatever grows is considered tar. You can eat from it. The Bar Tanura says halacha is not like Rabbi Yehuda, which means it's enough just to cut off the edible parts of the original plant. The next mitzvah is mitzvah loisase sholach reish b'shar v'chamor yachdav. Prohibition against plowing with an ox and a donkey together. Shenamar, it states, loisach reish b'shar v'chamor yachdav, you shall not plow with an ox or a donkey together. V'hu adin kol malacha. The same thing applies to all work. She'oise b'shnei minei behema oichaya. That one would do with two species of animal or two species of chayat, undomesticated animal. And one was a kosher species, one was a non-kosher species. That's the Torah's example. The shar, the ox is kosher, the chamar is not. So any work you do with a combination of two different domesticated animals or undomesticated animals, where one is a kosher species, one is not, will fall under this prohibition, such as planting. Let's say he leads them with his voice. He calls to them. And by calling to them, that's when they now schlep something. You get lashes for that. But one who just pairs them up, Pater is exempt until they actually do something together, which is pull, or he leads them. Okay. Va'afilu meya shehimshichu. Let's say we're talking about 100 people that pulled. Okay. That means that you had 100 people who pulled, or they went ahead and they led it in unison. Meaning you have these animals, and the animals are carrying something, and now you want to lead them. Either lead them by pulling them, you're leading them by directing them. You can have 100 people doing it together, or let's say 100 people piled onto a wagon, and just by sitting on a wagon, that causes the animals to start moving. Kulam Laikin, every one of them get lashes. Every one of them is considered that they led, that they worked with these animals together. This applies in all places at all times, both by men and by women. A wonderful day.